Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm particularly pleased to be here since only 2 hours ago I was sitting on Bristol station with my train cancelled. And I seem to have made it against all the odds. I'm very pleased to have done that, and thank you very much for being here again, those of you who've been following this odyssey through English building. We've now reached, I think, a particularly interesting stage in the story because, of course, the background to certainly the first part of the period I'm going to be talking about this evening is one of the most extraordinary periods in English history. Yeah, I mean, tremendous dynastic political instability. You've got the Civil War, you've got the Restoration, you've then got the Exclusion Crisis, you've then got the Glorious Revolution of 1688. But through all this chaos, in many senses, England's economy is completely and utterly transformed. By 1700, the country was a great power in the way it hadn't been before. And England's success was underpinned by a host of factors which could be a complete lecture in themselves this evening, and I can't go into them in detail. But essentially, they were a transformation in agricultural productivity, intensification of urbanization, an explosion in overseas trade, a credit revolution, and a series of wars that stimulated the economy. And these factors, as I say, each one of which I could talk about for a long time, stimulated and were stimulated by building construction of all sorts. And this was accompanied by a cultural shift of vast importance for building in England. Before the Civil War, the court was the centre of high culture and architectural impetus. By the 1660s, the initiative had shifted markedly towards the middle classes, towards merchants, towards the gentry, towards the middling sort of Englishmen. As we shall see, this is where innovation came from, and it was these people who started to make taste. Well, in the 1630s, the exotic cocktail of traditional forms blended with ornament from prints and source books that had dominated English architecture began to seem stale. And I showed you last time this extraordinary image, the courtyard of Burghley House, and you can see there the mélange that architecture in England had become in the early part of the 17th century. The mood became, by the 1630s, that this overworked and overdone architecture fell out of fashion, and there was a generation of plainer buildings that began to react against the excesses of the first 30 years of the century. So, look at this. 40 Hall, Enfield, completed in 1629 for Sir Nicholas Rainton, a rich merchant and one-time Lord Mayor of London. Just look at its elevations. Look how simple they are. They're only enlivened by those corner coins. Couple of string courses. Corner coins, couple of string courses. This Modillion cornice. This is later, this is later. 40 Hall is a recognisably different sort of house to those that were being built just 30 years earlier. The emphasis here is on the relationship of window to wall, and not at all on decoration or on the use of classical orders. And the roof is a revolutionary type of structure. It's no longer flat, lead flats, hidden behind a parapet or a balustrade. It's a hipped roof. In other words, there are no gables. All four sides slope down to the wall tops. This much more minimalist approach to design can't simply be seen as a reflection of a bloody civil war that led to a military dictatorship, nor, I think, is it easily identifiable with a more simplistic type of religion, although both of these factors were the background to it. These buildings, I think, should be seen in counterpoint to the excesses of Jacobean ornament. And a thirst, I think, for a much plainer, more simplified manner of building, which relied much more on proportion. And the development of these buildings was undertaken by a different sort of person. Because the traditional master craftsmen, who continued to play a central role, were added to by a new type of designer. These were men who hadn't come up through the traditional apprenticeship route, but had arrived at architecture through much more gentlemanly pursuits. The first of these was Inigo Jones. But during the 17th century, he was followed by men such as William Wynd, Henry Bell, William Samwell, Hugh May, Roger Pratt, Christopher Wren, and John Vanbrugh. These gentlemen might build for themselves, but they also designed for their social equals and their social superiors. Most of these gentlemen who were active in the 1660s had lived in the Netherlands, and many others had travelled further afield through France, and Germany and Italy. Many of them were with Charles II directly in his orbit during the interregnum. The most important of these people was Sir Roger Pratt, and he returned from the continent in 1649 and became the leading designer of the 1660s. And together with a small group of other people, he invented a distinctive rendition of classical architecture for England. Just 3 years into the Restoration, he designed this house, Kingston Lacy. The house's north front was designed into 3 sections. 1, 2, 3. The central section crowned by a pediment. It was raised up on a sub-basement, and it was given one of these steeply pitched roofs with dormers, capped with a balustraded platform on the top, and on top of that, a lantern. There was little in this composition that hadn't been tried before in some way in England. But proportionally, Kingston Lacy was a different sort of house. The addition of this pediment allowed the facade to be broken up, making it less monotonous. And the horizontal division of these 2 stories and this attic above a sub-basement gave the house a far less vertical feel than its metropolitan cousins, places like Forty Hall that I showed you a moment ago. An alternative type of house, incorporating the orders this time, was designed by another one of these gentleman architects, Hugh May. And this is Elton Lodge in Greenwich, built in 1665. Again, much here is familiar from before the Civil War. But here the facade is adorned with 4 Ionic pilasters and a pediment containing swags and a coat of arms. This sort of sense of proportion, I think, is here too, although the facade is very plain. There are no coins, no string courses, and altogether it has a more austere feel. Again, it has one of these hipped roofs, one of the early set of hipped roofs. Now, in plan, these houses, Kingston Lacy, Elton Lodge, were double pile. I explained in my last lecture, double pile, 2 sets of rooms, one behind each other. So you can have rooms in the front and rooms in the back and a spine wall in the middle. They were very like Charlton House that I showed you before. I showed you this plan before. This is Charlton House in Greenwich, a house built in the 1620s. You can see this is double pile here, and they had a big hall in the middle. They had a principal staircase and then staircases for servants. Both of the original plans of Eltham and Kingston Lacy have been changed, which is why I'm showing you an earlier building. I think these houses, I'm just going to go back to put on the screen Eltham Lodge, were influenced by buildings that people like Pratt and May had seen on the continent during the interregnum. But essentially, these houses grew out of a native tradition. and they captured, I think, the mood of the Restoration, and they became models for houses that really were to dominate England for the next 60 years. But at court, initially, something very different was going on. Because Charles II's court, in its first years, returned to the grand manner of the early Stuarts. John Webb, who was Inigo Jones's pupil, succeeded in winning Charles II's most important architectural commission, a new palace at Greenwich. The old palace had been all but destroyed during the Republic, and Charles II wanted to re-establish a building in the east for the reception of ambassadors. And the wing that Webb completed, which you see here, was a magnificent composition, built of Portland stone, rusticated with these giant orders, heavy keystones, big attics. This very much came out of the language of the banqueting house at Whitehall. But politically, economically, stylistically, it was completely out of kilter with what the king's courtiers were building. Yet, this building was not without influence, because many years after it was abandoned, because the palace was never finished, architects would turn to it again as a source for inspiration. Because in the 1690s, a new and much more assertive type of classicism began to come about. Many times in these lectures, I've talked about the English love of surface decoration. And in the 1690s, this reasserted itself in English design and combined with a reaction against the suave, minimalist classicism of the Restoration. So, just as the excess of the Jacobean period had led to the stripped classicism of Pratt and May, so that classicism led to a mannered version of itself that deliberately flouted the rules of classical architecture to create a sense of drama and excitement. Now, the origins of this revival of interest in the expressive, dramatic, and picturesque qualities of architecture comes with Charles II's rebuilding of Windsor Castle, a commission undertaken by Hugh May. From the outside, his apartments were austere and castle-like, but inside there was an explosion of illusionistic wall painting, which you see here in St George's Hall. This room was painted between 1674 and 1684 by Antonio Verrio. As you can see, this was a spectacular and theatrical interior, but it was also an interior on the cheap, because these rooms essentially were plastered boxes. The only thing in this room which wasn't a plastered box were these big coves here, which allowed Verrio to create an illusionistic sense of a big cornice. But despite the fact that they were cheap and cheerful architecture, the rooms at Windsor Castle were incredibly effective and soon had imitators in the great country houses. First of all at Chatsworth in Derbyshire, 1687 to 96, and then at Burley House in Lincolnshire, here's the Paradise Room, 1688 to 1998. And I think most of all, and most importantly, was Sir James Thornhill's masterpiece, the Painted Hall at Greenwich Hospital, completed between 1707 and 1714. Of these, only at Greenwich did the architecture begin to match the painting, because here Wren and Hawksmoor played with light and scale. I'm sure many of you have been into the Great Painted Hall at Greenwich, but you enter it through this extraordinary towering vestibule with gigantic pilasters and a huge jutting entablature, which is filled with light from the dome above. And from there, you ascend the steps through these massive Corinthian columns into the main vessel of the hall, which is lined with more gigantic pilasters, and it's lit with big windows from the side. And when you get to the end of the hall, there is this vast sort of proscenium arch which leads you into the upper end, the high end, which is enclosed in another smaller space equally filled with illusionistic wall painting. It was at Castle Howard in Yorkshire that Hawksmoor and Sir John Vanbrugh succeeded in introducing such extraordinary theatrical effects into a private house. And here, in 1702, they started a great central hall covered with a dome, supported on 4 great arches, each of which opened to a corridor or staircase. Incredibly difficult to photograph. Many of you will have been here before, but here you see these massive piers holding up the squinches and then the great dome, and you can just see the way these very theatrical staircases and balconies are squeezed into the composition. This, the extraordinarily lavish centrepiece of a private house, wouldn't have been out of place in a cathedral or a palace. But strange though it might seem, this ebullient architectural style was very easily transmitted from colossal commissions to domestic structures. And it was actually very popular in the houses of the gentry and even in townhouses and even terraces. Francis Smith of Warwick was one of the most accomplished designers in this style. He built Chicheley Hall for Sir John Chester. Chicheley with giant pilasters, you can see this great, rather extraordinary door case here, this sweeping cornice here with a decorated frieze, was quite a domestic structure. It's quite a small building. But you see, what he does is he makes fast and loose with the rules of classical architecture to create this sense of theatre and this sense of exuberance. But by around 1714, this sense of drama, this sense of richness, sense of silhouette and surface decoration that had been so admired around the turn of the century began to be less fashionable. And designers began to give greater emphasis to a much more faithful and precedent-based rendition of classical architecture, this time based on printed sources. And this mood, which really comes to fruition, as I say, around 1714, was reinforced by the preferences of the new ruler, George I, who, in his native Hanover, had promoted a style of architecture inspired by the buildings of the Veneto, the buildings in the countryside around Venice. And in the same years, around the accession of George I, 3 books were published, which, between them, provided the inspiration for architects for nearly a century. The first of these was by Jacopo Leoni. Leoni produced, with George I's approval, the first English version of Andrea Palladio's 4 books of architecture. Now, Palladio's book is a very important one. It's very important to understand what it was, because Leoni wasn't actually reproducing the designs of Palladio. What I show you here is the Villa Rotunda from Leoni's version of Palladio, and what I've put on the screen here is the original woodcut from Palladio's 4 books, and here the engraving from Leone's book. And what you will see that Leone did was he improved on Palladio. He changed the designs to accord much more with English taste. He obviously had at his fingertips the ability for engraving, which of course wasn't invented in the 16th century when Palladio's book was presented. So, the first point we need to make about the first of these three books is that although Leone published the first full English version of Palladio's 4 books of architecture, he was not bringing to the English public the architecture of Palladio. He was bringing his own interpretation of it. Leone's book was announced to the public for subscription in April 1715, at exactly the point that another very ambitious architectural publishing project was gaining momentum. This project was a compendium of plans and elevations of all the most important country houses in England, to be published under the title Vitruvius Britannicus. And this book was published by the Scottish architect Colin Campbell, who included in the book some of his own schemes and views. And so very much like Leone was pretending to reproduce the architectural drawings of somebody else, but actually basically promoting his own architecture, so was Campbell in producing plans and elevations of other people's buildings, promoting his own buildings too. But there was one contemporary architect whose work was not included in these very handsome engravings in Vitruvius Britannicus. And that was another rival, another architectural rival, James Gibbs. And the direct effect of James Gibbs's exclusion from the 3 volumes of Vitruvius Britannicus was that Gibbs went out to publish his own book of designs, which he called A Book of Architecture, which he published in 1728. I'm showing you a plate from it here. And Gibbs's book ended up being the most influential and important book of the 3. Because his book, A Book of Architecture, filled with designs which people could copy. People who hadn't got access to the leading architects of London could open Gibbs's books and take inspiration from them. As you see here, he just provides 3 examples of steeples that you could put. So people could come to these and copy them. This was, in fact, the first book in English by a living Englishman of his own designs. So, these 3 enormously important books transformed architectural discourse. Because what they did was allow a vastly wider spectrum of society to participate in architectural debate and to be informed by classical architecture. It became much more fashionable to try and create buildings much more faithfully according to the rules that were laid down by Leone, Gibbs, or Campbell. The fact that so much was now published also allowed people to be critical of buildings that somehow failed to stand up to these standards laid down in the texts. Everybody could now be an armchair architectural critic. Less so Leone, but both Campbell and Gibbs practiced what they preached, and their buildings were as influential as their books. Colin Campbell, in particular, went on to design a series of hugely influential country houses. The first and the largest of these was for Sir Richard Child at Wanstead in Essex. This house is built between 1714 and 1720. And this house, which you can see has this huge central block with giant Corinthian portico approached by stairs that double back on themselves, was flanked either side by these austere ranges, given a rhythm and a proportion by these windows with pediments over them. This was the first time a freestanding portico had been used on a private house. And this model was to spawn many imitators, either big or small, as here at Stour Head. This sort of architecture was by no means confined to country houses, because everyone, from the masters of Oxford colleges to town corporations, began to want to build like this. So here we have William Kent's Horse Guards in central London, Lord Burlington's Assembly Rooms in York, James Gibbs's Senate House in Cambridge, all of which were in styles that strove to be closer to the rules of classical building. Now, there was one invention that made these buildings look radically different to any building that had come before, and that was the sash window, the single most important architectural invention of the early 18th century. Because, of course, before sash windows, window openings were divided by transoms and mullions and contained iron frames that were hinged and could be opened, known as casements. And so if you had a window with transoms and mullions in it, of course you have this very big, heavy, cross-like shape in the middle of it. But the first sashes, which were an English invention invented in this country immediately after the Restoration, and the earliest one yet found has been found here, a picture of it, in Newmarket, in Charles II's palace there. This was built in the 1670s. And what you can see is the radical difference that the introduction of sashes made to a building. Now, this is rather a strange picture I'm showing you, but what I'm actually showing you here is a shot of Hampton Court. This building here, with these big buttresses on, is one of Henry VIII's tennis courts. And it originally had great big sort of Gothic-headed windows in each of these bays. What happened in the 1670s was, in the late 1660s, was that this tennis court was converted into lodgings for the Duke of York. And as it was converted to lodgings for Duke of York, it was given new windows. And this was the sort of window it was given. Can you see? A casement window. Only 10 years later, all the windows had to be replaced because they were unfashionable. And these windows are put in. And you can see the difference in what a building looked like between a building which has a casement and the building which has a sash window. It is a radically different look. So this is a fundamental revolution in the way buildings appeared and in the way you could start playing with the proportion, the differences in light and darkness in a facade. Now, a lot of the buildings I've been talking about have been outside London or the peripheries of London. I now want to take a much closer look at London itself. Because, again and again in these lectures, I have come back to the driving force that architectural change in London has been. When James I came to the throne, he was absolutely determined to improve the appearance of London. He regarded this as a matter of national prestige, and he established a commission to oversee the enforcement of a series of building proclamations. And this commission became a very big and powerful body with the stated purpose to improve the architectural quality and urban planning of the capital. The power of this commission was then reinforced by Charles I, who got Inigo Jones to sit on it. And through the 1630s, through this commission and their technical advisor, Inigo Jones, Charles I effectively nationalised the planning of London. And of all the developments of the 1630s, the most architecturally important and coherent was Covent Garden. So here we see Covent Garden in Hollis' engraving of the 1640s. Covent Garden was a bit of land between the city and Westminster that had been acquired by the Crown after the dissolution of the monasteries and then had been handed over to an aristocrat. Although it was superficially developed by that aristocrat, as it happens the 4th Earl of Bedford, the centrepiece of this, the piazza itself, was actually the outcome of a very complex financial and legal deal which created a royal square to rival the Place Royale in Paris. The king and his personal architect, Inigo Jones, basically took responsibility for the design, and the hapless Earl had to conform to their rather expensive tastes. So work began in 1629, and the first houses were let by 1631. The piazza, as you can see here, was not actually a square at all. It's a rectangle here. It's not enclosed on this side because this here is Bedford House, which is on this side. The whole of the west side is taken up by St Paul's Church and a vestry and a vicarage. But the houses here on this side were designed by Inigo Jones and modelled on Serlio's designs in his book of architecture. We can see them, I think, a bit better here. They were raised up on an arcade, as you can see, and there were pilasters between the windows, and you can see here this fashionable roofscape that I've been talking about before, these hip roofs with dormers on the top. The whole thing was stuccoed to give the impression of stone, although actually it was built of brick. The front doors of the houses were under here. There were rooms on the ground floor. On the principal rooms were on the first floor, and then there were bedrooms above. And in my last lecture, I explained how Inigo Jones, in a revolutionary sense, invented the mews, those of you who were here last time. So there were gardens behind here, then there were coach houses and stables, which allowed you to park your carriage and your horse round the back. This development very quickly became a magnet for the rich and titled and set an entirely new standard of housing for the West End. But it's very important that you don't go away this evening believing that Inigo Jones invented the London terrace, because he didn't. Houses built in a row had a long pedigree in England. By the 14th century, rows of shops with rooms above were a very common sight in London and other towns. Rows that were predominantly residential were known as rents, a term that persisted right up until the 19th century. And actually, the best place to go and see very early rows, and the word terrace is a very, very recent term. Throughout the 17th and 18th century, these are known as rows, is just around the corner from here, in St Bartholomew's Fairground, where between 1597 and 1616, the rich family developed a series of streets which were dominated by row houses. And amazingly, on your way home, ladies and gentlemen, this evening, you can see, as you go to Barbican Tube Station, one of the very earliest row houses that survives in this country. This is 74 Long Lane, dating from soon after 1598. Its principal elevation to the street was originally jettied, because this, you can actually still just see the jetty here. And if you go round the back, there's a narrow alley, and the entrance to the rooms above is by a narrow staircase. But it has to be admitted that before the 1660s, only a very small number of these rows, and there were a lot of them in London, were built in brick. And that is the reason why, of course, in 1666, when the fire came, 5/6 of the city of London had to be rebuilt anew. But the consequence of this was that by 1700, London was an absolutely modern metropolis. It was able to overtake all the other cities in Europe because it had absolutely bang up-to-date infrastructure and bang up-to-date architecture. The fire had in fact achieved what the monarchy had completely failed to do in the previous 60 years. Now, there are a number of things that are very important about the Great Fire of London as far as the development of building in England is concerned. Now, I can't hope to cover all this evening, but I'm just going to mention a couple of things that I think are particularly important and interesting. As you can see from this map, which highlights the locations of the burnt churches, 87 of the city's 107 churches became unusable, and it was agreed that 51 of them should be rebuilt after the fire, financed by coal tax. This was quite extraordinary, the most remarkable architectural commission that this country had ever seen up to that point. Christopher Wren was appointed to preside, and he was assisted by the most talented architects then working in England. And together, they worked a bit like a modern architect's office. Christopher Wren's sketching out the principal details, and the architects, the other architects, actually carrying through and executing the works. And the overriding concern was actually a liturgical one. That was the audibility and the visibility of the preacher. And the belief that a preacher's voice could only be heard 50 foot in front, 30 foot either side, and 20 foot behind defined the size of Christopher Wren's new city churches. And so these buildings were big, unencumbered spaces. One like this had been built before, and I'm going back to Covent Garden. Here is St. Paul's Covent Garden. Much altered inside now, but you can see this vast open space, which is what they were trying to achieve. But Wren's office, Wren's design team, took a highly pragmatic approach, treating every one of these churches in its site differently. Each one was composed using an extraordinary mix of Gothic and classical elements. The buildings were designed to be appreciated from the inside, because they were all built on cramped sites. So you get buildings which you can just glimpse through from the behind. But the really important thing about these churches isn't their street elevations. It isn't even really their interiors. It was the skyline. And this is the Rhinebeck Panorama, which you can see here in the Museum of London. When I was the director of the museum here, it was, I think, one of the most important things that I managed to acquire. What this shows is the way that the London Building Acts after the war, after the fire, restricted the height of domestic buildings to create this horizontality, and Wren's churches deliberately broke through it and raised above. This was the great achievement of the Great Fire of London. And this is the feature of London most remarked on by visitors in the 17th, 18th and the early 19th centuries. Well, in 1666, everyone had hoped that the cathedral, or at least bits of it, could be saved. But as we know, the damage was too much, and there was a big discussion about what the new cathedral should look like. Initially, Wren wanted to create a Greek cross. This was liturgically unacceptable, and so eventually, as we all know, the Greek cross design was set aside, and a Latin cross was built. But what is really important about the design of St. Paul's Cathedral is that it wasn't designed all at once. Wren and his big team of craftsmen and designers were forced to resolve the details of the church as it rose from the ground. The dome, for instance, wasn't finalised until 1697, and the west towers weren't designed until 1704. And so, in this way, the design of St. Paul's Cathedral wasn't a work of architecture, it was a scientific experiment. Because Wren modified the elements until he achieved the effect that he was trying to get to. So what was that effect? Well, I think that St. Paul's reveals Wren's fundamental weakness as a designer. If you look at his elevations, and there is the south transept, they are busy, they are fussy, they are crowded. He just couldn't leave it alone. He just couldn't. And inside the cathedral, I'm afraid, I just don't think it has any of the inspiration of the great Gothic cathedrals which lift your spirits, and I don't think it achieves any of the theatre of the great Baroque ones on the continent. The principal achievement of St. Paul's is the same as the city churches. These aren't pieces of architecture, these are pieces of landscape. The west front, as you approach it from Ludgate Hill, is one of the great picturesque achievements of the world, a work of genius conceived to be revealed as the spectator ascends the hill and moves round that sort of sinuous road. The whole of the west front explodes in front of you. The dome and the towers, as you saw on the Rhinebeck Panorama, dignify the monotonous skyline of London. And it is in this way that Christopher Wren achieved his brief. His brief was to recreate the sense of pride and confidence in the city after the fire, and that is what the cathedral did. Well, the rebuilding of the city after the fire, coupled with the development of the West End, had an astonishing effect on provincial towns. And again, I can't really go into this in a great deal detail tonight. Oh, sorry, I just wanted to show you that, which just makes my point about the landscape, and that is the cathedral having just been cleaned, of course, looking absolutely wonderful. I wanted to show you this, which is Queen Square, Bristol, which is where I was this afternoon, and just to make the point very, very briefly that all the other great towns, and of course Bristol was the second town of England, really, by this stage, copied what was going on in London. But the provincial towns were experiencing, by this date, a completely different type of society. Because what had happened after the Civil War was that the social distance of previous centuries had been eroded, and polite society now included anyone who could afford to dress well, who could converse easily, and who could behave appropriately. And this required, it must be admitted, property and education, but these commodities were now available to a very much larger section of society. And the phenomenon that took place in provincial towns is most clearly seen in the rage for assemblies. And these assemblies were a craze that gripped provincial England for a century after 1720. They started as gatherings for conversation, for cards and tea, but they quickly expanded to include dancing, both delicate minuets, as you see here, and more rumbustious country dances. Ultimately, their success was fired by the winning combination of sex and gambling, because the assemblies were a marriage mart for the young and gambling dens for the established. And it was Lindsay's Rooms in Bath of 1728 that created the model. Here, John Wood the Elder created the Seminal Assembly Room, a room with a big coved ceiling, lit from above by windows, with a gallery from which musicians could play, and mirrors lining the walls down here in which people could see them. Every single provincial town in England acquired an assembly room, broadly speaking, based on this. But there were other buildings, of course, that were engendered by this new polite society. And the most important of those was the theatres. The theatres, of course, had been closed down in 1642, but in a glorious moment, in 1674, the Theatre Royal in Drury Lane reopened in London, the first modern theatre in England. And this is Sir Christopher Wren's design for the theatre. Here you can see the stage, the scenic stage, and here the flats of the scene, which projects out beyond the proscenium arch. This is where the play actually took place. This is where the scenery sat. Here are the boxes, number 5. Here are the stalls, 3, the gallery, 4, 4, 4, the steps that allowed you to get up and down. And in the back here, the changing rooms and the rooms for the properties and the administration of the theatre. This building was hugely influential, and it transformed the architecture of entertainment, and it transformed the leisure habits of society. A seat in the pit cost you 2 shillings and 6pence. A seat in the boxes cost you 4 shillings. And although the season didn't continue into the summer months, when polite society, of course, went to the country, there were about 200 performances a year. Every town worth its salt wanted to copy Drury Lane. So here is the Theatre Royal in Bristol, featuring a lot this evening. Begun in 1764, it was closely based on drawings of Drury Lane. Bristol, again, the second town, a very grand theatre. Perhaps more common is this very charming theatre, the Playhouse in Richmond in Yorkshire, built in 1788. And you can see how there is a distant echo of Drury Lane in this distant provincial town. But in this explosion of fashionable life, fashionable society in the provinces, one town set the pace, and that, of course, was Bath. In Bath, a new sort of town was invented, a new sort of place, a place entirely devoted to the leisure pursuits of the rich. In Bath, the English invented the holiday, a period spent away from home and from the cares of every day. Bathing became entirely secondary, and then in fact became tertiary. In fact, it hardly became important at all. What became important were the assemblies, the concerts, the balls, the promenade, the gambling. These were the part of the everyday round. But, crucially, from around 1725, Bath not only began to set norms of social behaviour, it began to set architectural norms too. And this was largely down to John Wood, a builder and a surveyor, who had been involved in speculative developments in London in the early 1700s, but he came back to Bath in the 1720s and invented a form of building that was going to be terribly, terribly important. And that was a terrace, a row of houses that concealed the fact that it was a series of individual houses and actually looked like a grand palace. This was the first time in Europe anyone had invented this. This is Queen Square, Bath. Enormously successful and went on to influence every single town in England. But Wood was a very unusual person. He mixed architectural talent and commercial nous with a kind of weird antiquarian obsession. Because even before he started work on Queen Square, he conceived a completely megalomaniac scheme for Bath, which would include a royal forum, a grand circus, and an imperial gymnasium. And here you see what he did actually achieve. The circus of 33 houses was actually largely built in his lifetime, and his son continued the composition and the streets around it afterwards. The circus built 1755 to 67. And here you see what he built. He was inspired by the Colosseum in Rome, and what he did was turn the Colosseum inside out and put the outside of the Colosseum on the inside of the circus. It was a slightly loony scheme, actually, but it was incredibly effective and, again, incredibly influential and copied all over the country. Now, in my last 5 minutes, I want to move away from talking about urban architecture to return to talking about the state. Because at the beginning, I mentioned this large palace that was built for Charles II in Greenwich, but never finished. Because after the Restoration, there were 3 departments of state that were involved in architectural commissions. There was the Office of Works that were responsible for palaces, like Greenwich. There was the Navy Board, which is obviously responsible for the Navy. And there was the Board of Ordnance that was essentially responsible for building military buildings. And this is an important point that people very rarely make and is really important to remember. Between 1640 and 1760, broadly the period I'm covering this evening, these 3 offices of state commissioned more buildings between them than all the major individual buildings built by private owners put together. The Office of Works, the Board of Ordnance and the Navy Board, of course, were funded by the state and funded by the Crown. And the Restoration was a very important turning point in this. For the Army and the Navy, this was the first time since the Romans that England had a standing army, and it was the first time that Parliament continued investing money in the Navy. Because the government realised that after the Civil War, these were now permanent institutions. And the fact that the Navy and the Army were permanent institutions had major architectural consequences. Now, the Board of Ordnance had its headquarters in the Tower of London. And in 1664, the state found a solution to the problem that is currently dogging Libya. The problem being that after a civil war, everybody has a weapon. And you somehow have to get it off them if you want to stop the civil war and achieve peace. And so after the Civil War, the government is getting back all the ordnance, all the guns and weapons, and it's got to find somewhere to put them. And so what it builds is this enormous building in the Tower of London. BO stands not for body odour, stands for Board of Ordnance, and that is the Ordnance Board mark. And this building is extremely important. This is the Grand Storehouse, started in 1688, 360 foot long, 60 foot wide, of 3 stories, with a centrepiece. This is the first time that a military building is built in a classical style. And can you see that all the features that I described at Elton Lodge or at Forty Hall are all taken up here in a military building in the Tower of London. And there were many, many other buildings built by the Board of Ordnance in this style. The Navy, likewise, is building very actively. The surveyor of the Navy is a man called Edmund Dummer. He deserves to be as famous as Sir Christopher Wren. Unfortunately, many of his buildings are now lost, and many others are now still in use in naval dockyards, and it's impossible to go and see them. But he was responsible for building really almost entire towns, Plymouth in particular, huge amount of development, big residential terraces being constructed. These dockyards, and this is Sheerness on the screen, these dockyards were major centres of manufacture. Initially, building, accommodating their buildings in temporary-looking structures like this with clapperboard on the outside. But by 1700, these buildings were being built much more elaborately, and as you see here, this is again Chatham Dockyard, the first modern warehouse built by the Navy many, many years before the Industrial Revolution, but actually, in truth, the first industrial building. Well, ladies and gentlemen, tonight we've covered, I think, a key period in English architectural history. A period in which architectural style and taste became a matter of concern for a vastly wider spectrum of people. The merchants, gentry, military officers, all participating in architectural discourse. And this was possible because there had been a change in economic gravity in England. That shift had moved towards the middle classes. And then, because of the proliferation of printed matter, a style was established that people could actively participate in. The people who made buildings changed too. The ranks of craftsmen and builders were added to by gentlemen architects. And so these changes were very fundamental and represented a shift in the story of building in England, away from centuries of architecture dominated by craftsmen and aristocrats. Well, I'm sorry to say that you're going to have to wait until the 7th of February to find out how these changes then combined with a period of technological innovation to propel Britain into global superpowerdom. Thank you.